Let me ask you something strange. What if the most dangerous moment in an empire's life is not when people are panicking, but when leaders are telling everyone that things are finally stable? Because throughout history, the exact same signal appears right before collapse. Not once, not twice, every single time. Rome saw it. Britain ignored it. 1929 dismissed it. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The United States just triggered that same signal. Not in theory, not symbolically, mathematically. And once the signal appears, there has never been a soft landing, ever. In this video, I'm going to show you the final warning sign that empires always ignore right before they break. Why it feels reassuring at first, why it tricks even smart people, and why historically, once it shows up, the clock is already running. Stay with me, because near the end, I'm going to show you the exact moment this signal appeared in America and why 2026 keeps showing up in the data. Most people think empires collapse during chaos. They imagine riots, empty shelves, currency hyperinflation overnight. That is not how it actually happens. Empires collapse after long periods of stress, when leaders finally choose stability over truth. This is the moment when an empire stops trying to grow and starts trying to manage decline without admitting it. Historically, this moment always looks responsible. It sounds calm. It sounds mature. It sounds like adults are finally back in the room. And that is why it is so deadly. Because this is the point where the system becomes fragile, not resilient. Think about what this means in practical terms. A healthy system absorbs shocks through adaptation. A business fails and resources move somewhere more productive. An asset price crashes and capital reallocates to better opportunities. Interest rates rise and borrowing slows naturally. These feel painful in the moment, but they are how systems stay honest. They prevent small problems from becoming existential threats. Late-stage empires lose this ability not because leaders are corrupt, but because the accumulated fragility has become so severe that any honest adjustment would trigger immediate crisis. So they make a choice. Preserve the appearance of stability. Suppress the signals of stress and promise the public that everything is under control. This is not conspiracy. This is incentive. No leader wants to be the one who admits the party is over. No institution survives that admission. So they delay. They manage narratives. They redefine metrics. And the system quietly hollows out from the inside. Let me show you what that signal actually is. The final signal is simple to describe, but devastating in effect. It is when an empire chooses financial suppression over economic truth. In plain language, this is when leadership says, we can no longer allow markets, money, or citizens to respond naturally because the consequences would be too destabilizing. So instead, they freeze the system in place. They cap interest rates. They control money supply narratives. They redefine inflation. They suppress volatility. They promise stability at all costs. Not because things are strong, but because things are too weak to handle reality. This is the moment where the system becomes performative. It still looks functional, but it no longer heals itself. And once that happens, history shows there is only one direction left. Here is the key insight that most people miss. Financial suppression is not the same as financial regulation. Regulation tries to prevent abuse while still allowing markets to function. Suppression tries to prevent outcomes that reveal underlying weakness. One accepts reality and shapes behavior within it. The other denies reality and tries to hold it back by force. When a system crosses that line, something fundamental breaks. Price discovery stops working. Risk assessment becomes impossible. Capital allocation turns political, and the entire economy slowly transforms from a productive engine into a managed narrative. On the surface, everything looks fine. Markets stay elevated. Unemployment numbers appear stable. Growth continues at some positive percentage. But underneath, the mechanisms that create real wealth are atrophying, because real wealth comes from honest feedback loops, and suppression destroys feedback. Rome did not collapse when it was chaotic. Rome collapsed when it tried to stabilize decline. For centuries, Rome expanded through productivity, trade, and conquest. That expansion created real wealth. But eventually, expansion slowed. Costs rose, debt exploded, military spending ballooned. Rome faced a choice. Either allow economic pain and political unrest, or hide the pain by manipulating money. They chose stability. They debased the currency slowly at first, then more aggressively. They fixed prices. They punished hoarding. They controlled trade. Every one of these moves was sold as responsible governance. And every one of them destroyed trust. What makes the Roman example so instructive is the gap between the signal and the visible collapse. Decades passed. For years, the empire appeared to function normally. Armies still marched, roads still operated, taxes still flowed from the provinces. On the surface, Rome looked intact. But underneath, something critical had changed. Once prices were controlled, Farmers stopped producing surplus. Why grow extra wheat if you cannot sell it for what it costs to produce? Once currency was debased, merchants stopped accepting official money. Why take coins that lose value every year? Once trade was restricted, regions became isolated. Why ship goods across the empire if permits, tariffs, and confiscations make it unprofitable? The empire did not collapse because resources disappeared. It collapsed because the system stopped being able to allocate resources efficiently. And once allocation becomes political instead of economic, decline accelerates. By the time citizens realized what was happening, the system could not reverse without collapsing instantly. So leaders doubled down. More controls, more suppression, more reassurance. Rome did not fall because of barbarians. The barbarians just arrived after the system was already hollow. This is the pattern. Suppression feels like strength at first. It looks like control. It sounds like leadership. But it is actually the moment when the empire trades long-term survival for short-term appearance. Now, fast forward the British Empire. Britain did not collapse when it lost wars. It collapsed when it lost financial dominance and tried to preserve the illusion of control. After World War I, Britain was drowning in debt. The war had been financed through borrowing on a scale never seen before. The economy was no longer productive enough to support both the debt and the empire. But instead of restructuring honestly, Britain tried to maintain stability. They returned to the gold standard at the wrong price. Why? Because the gold standard was the symbol of British financial power. Abandoning it would have meant admitting that Britain was no longer the center of global finance. That was politically unacceptable. So they locked the pound to gold at a rate that overvalued the currency. This made British exports uncompetitive overnight. It made British labor too expensive. It triggered deflation across the economy. Unemployment exploded. Industries collapsed. But Britain held the line. They suppressed wages. They controlled capital flows. They insisted that maintaining the gold standard was a matter of national credibility. The goal was simple: restore confidence without fixing fundamentals. It worked briefly. Foreign investors saw the commitment. Markets stabilized. The pound held its value. Leaders declared victory. Then it broke everything. Exports collapsed. Unemployment surged beyond anything seen in peacetime. Global confidence evaporated as other nations realized Britain could not maintain the policy without destroying its own economy. Within a decade, Britain abandoned the gold standard anyway. But the damage was done. Britain chose stability, optics over economic truth. And once again, the empire never recovered its former power. The lesson here is critical. The signal is not the policy itself. The signal is the decision to prioritize the appearance of strength over the reality of adaptation. Now, let's talk about the one example everyone thinks they understand. Most people believe the Great Depression happened because of greed and speculation. That is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The real disaster came after the crash. When the market collapsed in October 1929, the immediate damage was severe, but not catastrophic. Wealth was destroyed. Confidence was shaken. But the economy still had productive capacity. Factories existed. Workers existed. Resources existed. What turned a market crash into a decade-long depression was not the crash itself. It was the response. Instead of allowing markets to clear and reset, leadership tried to freeze the system in place. Interest rates were manipulated to prevent further decline. Banks were protected from failure to preserve confidence. Bad debt was preserved instead of written off. Liquidation was prevented. The goal was stability. Prevent panic. Prevent bank runs. Prevent deflation. But here is what actually happened. By preventing liquidation, they prevented recovery. Bad loans stayed on the books. Failed businesses kept operating. Resources stayed trapped in unproductive uses. The economy could not heal because pain was suppressed, not resolved. Credit froze. Investment stopped. Employment collapsed not in months, but over years. What should have been a sharp but brief recession turned into the worst economic disaster in modern history. This turned a recession into a depression. Once again, stability killed recovery. And here is the part that should terrify you. Throughout the entire period, officials kept insisting that their policies were working, that recovery was around the corner, that the fundamentals were sound. They were not lying deliberately. They genuinely believed that stability was the answer. But stability achieved through suppression is not stability. It is stasis. And stasis in a dynamic system is just slow death. Here's why people always miss this. Financial suppression feels calming at first. Lower rates feel supportive. Interventions feel protective. Reassurance feels responsible. When authorities step in to stabilize markets, it looks like competence. When they promise to do whatever it takes, it sounds like strength. When they insist that the situation is under control, people want to believe them. But stability achieved through control is not stability. It is delayed failure. The system loses feedback. Risk piles up invisibly. Small problems become massive. And by the time volatility returns, it does so violently. Think of it like this. Imagine a forest where every small fire is immediately suppressed. For years, that forest looks pristine. No charred trees, no burnt clearings, just endless green. But underneath the surface, dead wood is accumulating. Underbrush is thickening. Fuel is building. Eventually, a fire starts that cannot be contained. And when it burns, it does not burn a few acres. It burns everything. That is what financial suppression does to an economy. It prevents small corrections, small failures, small adjustments. And in doing so, it guarantees that when the system finally breaks, it breaks catastrophically. That is why collapses feel sudden. Even though they are years in the making, the instability was always there. It was just hidden, suppressed, delayed until it could not be delayed any longer. Now we arrive at the uncomfortable part. The United States has officially entered the financial suppression phase. This is not opinion. This is observable policy. Interest rates can no longer rise freely. Why? Because the cost of servicing the national debt makes higher rates economically impossible. Every percentage point increase adds hundreds of billions in annual interest payments. The system cannot tolerate normal rates anymore. Debt servicing costs dictate policy, not growth, not productivity. Debt. When debt becomes the constraint, every decision is about managing liabilities, not creating value. Markets are conditioned to intervention. Every significant decline is met with assurances of support. Every crisis is met with liquidity. Every instability is met with promises that authorities will not let things break. This is not a judgment on whether these interventions are good or bad in isolation. This is an observation about what they signal. They signal that the system is now too fragile to function without continuous support. Every major institution now prioritizes stability narratives over structural reform. Debt is not being reduced. It is being rolled, extended, redefined. The goal is not to fix the underlying problem. The goal is to extend the timeline. Inflation is not being defeated. It is being reframed, measured differently, explained differently, managed through narrative as much as through policy. This is the same playbook. Rome chose stability over truth. Britain chose credibility over adaptation. 1929 chose preservation over correction. And America is now making the same choice. Once an empire reaches this stage, history shows the outcome is locked in. The only variable is timing. Here is why 2026 matters. Not because of prophecy, because of convergence. Debt rollover cycles. The United States faces massive refinancing needs in the mid-200s. Trillions in debt must be rolled over at rates far higher than when it was originally issued. Demographic cliffs. The boomer generation is exiting peak productivity and entering peak entitlement withdrawals. Social Security, Medicare, pension obligations, all of these hit simultaneously. Currency, trust decay. The dollar's role as global reserve currency depends on confidence in American stability and economic dominance. That confidence is eroding as alternatives emerge and fiscal credibility declines. Geopolitical realignment. The post-World War II order that made America the uncontested global power is fragmenting. Other powers are rising. Alliances are shifting. The cost of maintaining dominance is increasing while the benefit is decreasing. These forces are compressing. Empires do not collapse randomly. They collapse when multiple pressures peak at once. When debt cycles align with demographic strain, when currency weakness meets geopolitical challenge, when the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the capacity to fund it. 2026 is where those curves intersect. Not perfectly, not precisely, but close enough that the window of optionality closes. That does not mean collapse happens overnight. It means the system loses optionality. From that point forward, every decision makes things worse. You can delay the crisis or you can trigger the crisis, but you cannot prevent the crisis. History also shows something hopeful. People who recognize this signal early do not panic. They adapt. They simplify. They reduce exposure to promises. They move toward things that do not require trust in institutions. Throughout history, the people who navigate imperial collapse successfully are not the ones who predict the exact date. They are the ones who recognize the phase early enough to reposition before options disappear. They stop chasing returns and start protecting purchasing power. They move away from assets that depend on institutional stability, long-duration bonds, pension promises, currency-denominated savings. All of these require the system to remain functional. They move toward assets that hold value independently, real assets, productive resources, things that do not require counterparty performance. They diversify geographically. They reduce dependence on any single system. They build optionality. They understand that the goal is not to profit from the collapse. The goal is to not be dependent on a fragile system when it breaks. This is not about fear. This is about pattern recognition and calm preparation. The people who survive imperial transitions are not the loudest. They are the earliest. They move before permission is needed. They act before narratives shift. The final signal is always ignored for one reason. Admitting it exists means admitting the era is ending. No leader wants that. No institution survives that truth. So they promise stability. They suppress symptoms. They buy time. And time runs out anyway. But here's the paradox. The longer they delay, the worse the eventual adjustment becomes. Early intervention is painful but manageable. Late intervention is catastrophic. Rome could have restructured in the 200s. It would have been hard. Citizens would have suffered, but the empire might have survived. By the time they tried to stabilize in the 300s, it was already too late. Britain could have restructured after World War I. It would have meant accepting a diminished role. It would have hurt national pride. But the economy could have adapted. By the time they abandoned the gold standard in 1931, the damage was permanent. America could restructure now. It would be painful. It would require sacrifice. It would mean admitting that the current trajectory is unsustainable. But it would be survivable. The question is whether leadership will choose short-term pain for long-term survival or short-term stability for eventual collapse. History suggests they will choose stability every time. This video is not about fear. It is about pattern recognition. Every empire reaches a moment where truth is too painful. So stability becomes the priority. That moment has already arrived. The only question left is whether you recognize it early enough to act calmly. History is not repeating because people are stupid. It repeats because human systems always choose comfort over correction. If you understand that, you're already ahead of most. And that is the real advantage.